In the twilight of dusk, the tired figure of Carolina emerged from a taxi. Her eyes, still marked by the exhaustion of childbirth and the emotion of bringing a new life into the world, were mixed with a blend of happiness and concern. In her arms, wrapped in a blue wool blanket, was her newborn, still unaware of the complications of the outside world. The little Mimito, as she called him, had a birthmark in the shape of a heart on the nape of his neck. This only made his mother rejoice even more in him. As the taxi departed, leaving behind a trail of smoke and the murmurs of distant anger, a figure darted from the shadows towards Carolina. It was Alessandro, her husband and Mimito's stepfather. His gaze was fixed and determined, his lips pressed into a tense line. Before she could explain what was happening with surprising force, he snatched the newborn from her arms. "Alessandro, what are you doing?" Carolina asked, desperately trying to regain her child. However, her body, still weak from recent childbirth, did not respond as she wished. Her legs trembled and her arms, though outstretched in an attempt to reach her child, felt heavy and numb. Alessandro, without looking at her, without saying a word, held Mimito close to his chest and carried him inside. He then placed him in the crib and stood watching. Carolina entered the house, puzzled by her husband's behavior, but she didn't dwell on it. That night, she slept beside Mimito's crib. However, her terror was immense when she woke up the next morning and found Mimito was not there. She jumped out of bed and began searching for her son in every corner of the room, looked under the crib, among the blankets, and behind the toys, but there was no trace of Mimito. A sense of panic engulfed her, and her mind was filled with unimaginable nightmares. Immersed in a sea of anguish, her eyes fixed on the empty crib, and a shiver ran down her spine. The terrible reality slowly took hold of her mind. Her beloved treasure, Mimito, had disappeared into the darkness like a fleeting sigh. Carolina desperately searched for him everywhere, and to her surprise, she saw that Mimito's absence didn't seem to affect Alessandro. She notified the authorities, who searched for months for Mimito, to no avail. Months passed with no news of her son's whereabouts. "Where are you, my son?" she sighed, hoping that fate would bring back her beloved child. Carolina was lost in a sea of anguish, while Alessandro seemed to float in a state of extreme tranquility. Suspicions tormented her, and the question lingered in her mind. Did Alessandro have something to do with Mimito's disappearance? Despite her efforts to make him confess something, Alessandro's lips never uttered a word that incriminated him. His silence was overwhelming, like a dense fog enveloping the room, fueling growing uncertainty in the air. Carolina became a widow after becoming pregnant with Mimito, and suddenly found herself in an overwhelming reality. She was alone, pregnant, and unemployed. "And now, my heart's son, what do we do?" she asked, covering her belly with both hands. It was then that Alessandro, a caring man, crossed her path and cut through the shadows of despair. He said he loved her and that they would start a family by adopting Mimito. And so, a happy family with her belly growing every day. The emotional and economic burden began to collapse, threatening to extinguish any spark of hope within her. Thus, Carolina accepted Alessandro's offer and moved into his house. "Today you would be celebrating your birthday, my dear son," she sighed nostalgically, as memories intertwined deeply in her soul. It had been 25 years since Mimito's mysterious disappearance, when fate tore him from his mother's arms. Carolina never overcame the pain in her motherly heart, which always harbored hope of finding her son again. Carolina and Alessandro, once young and full of hope, now faced the weight of the years and a life marked by lovelessness and tragedies. At 60 years old, the marks of time were evident in deep wrinkles on their faces, revealing the accumulated unhappiness over the years. Carolina felt the need to experience the deep maternal love that burned in her heart. One day, she decided to approach Alessandro and present an idea. "What if we had a child?" she asked. However, Alessandro's disagreement became the cause of their constant disagreement. "Alessandro, are you drinking again?" she asked, surprised as she slowly approached him. "Give me that bottle, you've had enough." She tried to take the bottle of liquor from him, but Alessandro resisted. "Leave me alone, woman, don't meddle in my affairs," he replied, irritated. Back in her room, Carolina sighed and said to herself, "I don't know what to do anymore." Every night, the sound of empty bottles and tears merge into a heartbreaking symphony that echoes through the walls of our house, like a constant reminder of our unhappiness. Gradually, Alessandro stopped working, and at first, Carolina didn't notice. However, as time passed, reality began to weigh on her like a burden. The couple's financial support became a weight that Carolina had to carry on her shoulders, her body tired and exhausted from long days of work as a housemaid in someone else's home. Every day, upon returning home, tears accumulated in her throat and turned into a knot of bitterness that threatened to choke her hope. One day, by chance, while Carolina was cleaning the master bedroom of the house, she stumbled upon a partially raised floorboard. The blow echoed in the room, interrupting the seemingly tranquil silence that surrounded her. As Carolina stared at the boards, her heart began to beat uncontrollably, driven by curiosity. She bent down to examine it closer, with trembling and cautious hands. A strong coughing fit surprised her as she inhaled the dense, dusty air that emerged from the small cracks. It took her a while before she could continue checking. A shiver ran down her spine as she wondered what could be hidden underneath. With trembling hands, she lifted the paralyzed board, only to see what was hidden there. An old, dusty pouch, as if it had been forgotten by time. Carolina moved cautiously, thinking she was about to discover something terrifying. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the threatening thoughts that invaded her, and with trembling fingers, firmly grasped the small pouch. She did her best to hold her breath as she slowly opened it, as if opening the door to a dark and mysterious world. This can't be, is it him? But that's not his name, Carolina thought. The tension in her chest intensified as her eyes suddenly met identification documents. The name on the documents wasn't Alessandro, as Carolina knew her husband, but Raphael. Confusion and fear seized her. Who was this man with whom she had shared so many years of her life? What secrets did he hide behind this false identity? However, the situation would worsen. Carolina discovered old newspaper clippings alongside the identification documents. When she read them, her astonishment was so great that her eyes widened and a chill ran down her spine. Her eyes fixated on the black letters recounting an inexplicable disappearance. "My God, how is this possible?" Carolina murmured. Raphael, or rather, Alessandro, had been suspected in the disappearance of his own stepchildren. Fear turned into panic as Carolina tried to assimilate the terrible truth that unfolded before her. Have I been living with a possible criminal all this time? What other secrets does this house hide? Carolina found out that the man mentioned in the newspaper clippings from her previous relationship had also had two small stepchildren who disappeared in mysterious circumstances. Authorities had classified him as the prime suspect and were about to arrest him when he showed up that night. When Alessandro came home, Carolina stood in front of him and looked him straight in the eyes. "Alessandro, or should I say Raphael, what are these papers?" she asked, showing him the contents of the pouch she had found. "Where did you get this?" Alessandro said with fury. His face turned alarmingly pale as he approached Carolina to snatch the papers from her. Alessandro revealed to his wife that he had been forced to flee and change his identity to avoid being unfairly arrested. However, he insisted on his innocence, swearing that he was innocent. "Why did you have to flee, Alessandro? You're not innocent, or is there something more sinister hidden behind your anger?" Carolina said, with an urgent yet cautious tone of voice. "I had to flee because I knew that if I stayed, I would be unjustly arrested." "Yes, I am innocent, but the circumstances were against me," he said, nervously and angrily. Carolina thought of Mimito. Suspicion had settled in her mind like a dark cloud, enveloping her in a cruel abyss of uncertainty. What happened to Mimito? Is it possible that Alessandro is responsible for his disappearance? She thought. Doubts threatened to completely shatter her. She tried to broach the subject again, but no matter how hard she tried to extract the truth from Alessandro about Mimito's whereabouts, he insisted that he had nothing to do with it. "For God's sake, woman, not this again?" he replied angrily whenever Carolina mentioned her son. As time went by, Alessandro continued to be immersed in a self-destructive spiral, leading a life full of excesses. His body weakened more and more due to excessive alcohol consumption, on the verge of illness. It was then that fate played a trick and his kidneys failed alarmingly. Carolina was surprised by the sound of the phone that morning. She paled as she answered the call. What? How is he? What happened? Yes, of course, I'm coming, she said, after being informed that her husband was in the emergency room of the hospital. Carolina rushed to the hospital and asked the nurse about her husband's condition. The nurse specified the young doctor who was taking care of him. "Oh, look, the doctor is coming. He's attending to him right now," said the nurse. She had a strange feeling that she knew the doctor. "Yes, tell me," she said gently to the doctor. And the words that reached Carolina's ears as a gentle suggestion awakened her from her stupor. The nurse had informed her that she was the patient's wife. "I'm sorry, doctor, I'm Alessandro's wife." "Please, tell me how he is," she said with concern in her voice. The doctor, with a serious face, explained, "Alessandro's kidneys are in critical condition, and urgent measures are needed to prevent a fatal progression. Please accompany me to see him. Your presence will make this news more bearable." As they made their way to the room where Alessandro was, Carolina felt lost in a sea of worries due to the shocking news of her husband's illness. "Sandro, regrettably, without a kidney transplant, you won't survive much longer," said the doctor. Carolina was stunned by the news. The doctor added, "We've been searching for a compatible donor, but time is running out quickly." The news was overwhelming, and Carolina found herself in a desperate situation, not knowing what to do to save her husband's life. Alessandro, sobbing, said, "It can't be, doctor, please help me. You see, my wife has no one else. I'm her only support. Imagine what will become of her if I leave this world." Carolina understood the devastating impact of the doctor's words, which affected Alessandro with infinite tenderness. She enveloped her husband in a loving embrace, seeking to alleviate the sadness in their hearts. "Calm down, I'm sure we'll find a donor soon," said Carolina. "Poor people," thought the doctor, while silently observing the elderly couple, moved by this gesture that intertwined sadness and hope. The scene deeply touched his heart, and he wondered how he could help them. The doctor, a kind-hearted man with a compassionate gaze, looked at Carolina. He wondered why this elderly woman moved him so much and why he felt the urge to help her. After a few seconds of silence, he said to Alessandro, "Don't worry, I'll do everything in my power to help." In the following days, the doctor, with a voice full of sorrow and hopelessness, gave them devastating news. "Unfortunately, I haven't found any compatible donor for you." Their hope was ripped away in an instant by the doctor's words, aware of the grave situation the elderly couple faced. They clung desperately to each other, as if tomorrow were doomed to disappear into the shadows. However, fate had a surprise in store for them. Despite the concerns and risks associated with the operation, the doctor, who was of a generous heart, made a life-changing decision for all. Since there was no compatible donor, the doctor proposed to save Alessandro's life by offering to donate one of his kidneys, so the elderly man could survive, ensuring that his wife, Carolina, would not be left alone and helpless. Upon learning this, Carolina quickly walked to the doctor's office, with a mixture of emotions stirring her heart with gentle beats. She knocked on the door until a warm voice instructed her to enter. The doctor's face lit up when she walked in. "Come in, Mrs. Carolina, what brings you here?" The sparkle in his eyes reflected the satisfaction of someone who can change lives and bring infinite hope. With a trembling voice, Carolina said, "Doctor, I've come to thank you for your generous sacrifice to give my husband a new chance at life." The doctor humbly replied, "Don't worry, Mrs. Carolina," and they continued to chat amiably, as if they were great friends from a lifetime. The doctor, excitedly, shared some details about his life. "My name is Guilherme, but people usually call me Mimito. I'm only 25 years old, but I'm already a doctor. What do you think of that, Mrs. Carolina?" Carolina suddenly felt her heart race. With pride, she exclaimed, You're my son, my Mimito." With tears in her eyes, she threw herself onto the doctor and hugged him tightly. Carolina, flooded with joy, had spent years dreaming of that moment, the reunion with her son. Her heart had been broken and her life aimless. But finally, after all this time, that day had come. Mother and son reunited. Now, mother and son had much to talk about. Mimito told his mother that she was a woman of great heart. "You found a newborn, thrown into a sewer on the street at midnight. And you raised him, gave him education," explained Carolina. Carolina enters her husband's room, Alessandro, excitedly. I found my son, he's here. Mimito is the same doctor who's been taking care of you. She tells him everything that happened. This can't be true, Alessandro responds, apparently cheerful. It's good that you finally found your son, he replies. Now, I want you to tell me what really happened. I'm sure you had something to do with my son's disappearance. If you don't tell me, I'll reveal everything about your past to Mimito. Alessandro feels cornered. If he doesn't tell the truth, this woman will tell everything to the doctor, and then he won't donate the kidney to me anymore, and I'll lose my life. So, he has no other choice but to confess. After a long sigh of resignation, Alessandro begins to tell his story. That night, while you were asleep, I took little Mimito, carried him, and threw him into a sewer. Carolina is horrified by what she just heard. How could you do that? But I knew, he replies. My mother's heart told me, understand, woman. I never wanted children, much less one who wasn't mine. Carolina is a woman who is always willing to see the best in people, even when they hurt her. So, she decides to forgive Alessandro and leave behind any resentment she might hold in her heart. However, Carolina feels the need to open her heart and share her story with her son. She tells him everything without hiding any detail. Although Alessandro has caused her much harm, she decides to forgive him. You'll still receive the kidney from me, Alessandro says. But after that, I don't want to see you in my life anymore. I'll take my mother with me and you'll never come near her again, understood? He says in a threatening tone. Yes, yes, he quickly responds, feeling great relief. After all, he would still receive the kidney, not caring about anything else. Alessandro undergoes surgery and the kidney is transplanted. When he wakes up, he's back in the room, feeling a sensation of pain and discomfort. Although still a bit numb, he hears the voice of a man telling him the operation was a success. He looks for where that voice is coming from. To his surprise, there are Carolina and Mimito. What are you doing here? He asks with evident anger. We just wanted to make sure everything would turn out well, says Carolina, surprised by Alessandro's hostile attitude. With great fury, he shouts, "Get out of here." It seemed as if a supernatural force had taken hold of him. I don't regret what I did. In fact, I would do it again. I never wanted children, let alone one that wasn't mine, he says. As he says these words, his face reflects great resentment. At that moment, Alessandro collapses, abruptly leaving this world. Carolina and Mimito are devastated by the impact. Alessandro's body ruthlessly rejected the transplant, condemning him irremediably to his final fate. It turns out that the transplant was done believing that the data provided by Alessandro were correct. No one knew that these documents were false, his blood type was not what the documents said, and that's why the organ was rejected by his body, leading to his departure from this world. Mother and son are now happy. They learned that love, perseverance, and self-confidence can overcome any adversity. Carolina feels blessed to have such an incredible son, and Mimito is grateful to have his mother by his side. Mimito introduces his biological mother to his adoptive mother. Now he knows that family is not limited to blood ties, but is the result of love, respect, and mutual care. Grateful to have two wonderful mothers, Mimito has learned to value diversity and the importance of family relationships in all their forms. That's it for today's story. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to leave your like if you did and subscribe, activating the notification bell so you won't miss more stories like this one. Until next time.